Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Um, as you all know, you're joining the AVPA and SANCOP Dialogues webinar, Partnering to Crush the Curve. This week, we're going to be specifically looking at the economic impact of COVID-19 on the informal sector. As you all sort of join in, it would be great if you could just message in the chat box where you're joining from. It's always lovely to see where our folks are coming from the webinar. So just give a quick shout out in the chat box and tell us your name and what city and country you're coming from today. I think we'll maybe give it another, maybe Nancy, you want to give it another minute or so for some more participants to join, or do you want to go ahead and get started?
Yeah, sure. Let's give it a minute. Yeah.
Okay, super. James, good to see you. I think James has joined us for every webinar so far.
Yeah, every week.
James is a veteran to our webinar series.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's good to be part and parcel of this.
Thanks so much, James.
Super. Janet has joined us. Great.
Wonderful. Nigeria's OECD team from Paris. Welcome, Esme. That's great. Uganda, Nigeria again. Quite a few folks in Kenya. Dr. Demi from London. Welcome. Amit from India. Fantastic. Oh, and hi, Emily from Zambia. This is fantastic. Awesome.
Great representation. Wonderful.
Great representation. All right, super, Nancy. Well, we're at about 40 people now, and it's continuing to increase. For those of you who are just joining, say hi in the chat box and let us know where you're from, city and country. It's just nice to see where people are coming from. And I think we'll go ahead and get started. So Nancy, over to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Ariel. Hi, everybody. Wonderful to see so many participants. My name is Nancy Cairo. I'm the Executive Director for AVPA East Africa region. And I want to welcome you to this third series of webinars that we've been organizing around COVID-19 response, bringing people together and discussing the various interventions that are going on across the continent. For those of you who don't know AVPA, Africa Venture Philanthropy Alliance, we're a Pan-African network. We have offices in Nigeria, Nairobi, and South Africa. And we bring together what we call the whole continuum of social investors. That's basically means from philanthropists to impact investors, debt and equity providers, government, and even DFIs to bring capital to the table. And that capital doesn't have to be always in the form of financial capital. It could be intellectual or human capital. But to bring capital to the table, work in a collaborative and very strategic manner. Our mission is basically to increase the flow of capital that's going towards investing in solving Africa's social issues. And we all know today one of the most pressing issues is COVID-19. So we're really happy to have these webinars to bring people together to discuss what they're doing, what the gaps are, what they've learned, what you would do differently, and how we can help each other. So welcome to the webinar. We have some really exciting speakers today, 2 from Nigeria and 1 from South Africa. And I think I'll go straight into our first poll. Is that right, Ariel? Do we have a poll?
Yep, go for it. Margaret, you can push out the poll.
Margaret, do you have the poll? Great, there we go. So we wanted everybody to get a chance to tell us a little bit about, how you're thinking in terms of the impact of this disease on the informal economy. So you can see there, what parts of the informal economy do you think will be most affected by COVID-19 in Africa? So please fill out the poll and let's see what everybody's thinking.
And maybe we'll leave it up for another 10 or 15 seconds. So please go ahead and submit your response.
I don't think you have the poll up. This is the answer sheet. The poll results, not the poll itself.
Oh yeah, it said result.
Sorry, there we go. Let me try that again.
Thanks, James.
Thanks, James.
There you go. So we were showing the wrong
sorry, that was my fault.
Screen. So as people fill out the poll, I'll tell you a little bit about our speakers today. We have Gigi Alcock from South Africa, who has written a book called Carcinomic Revolution, which explores the revolution taking place in the marketplaces and informal sectors across South Africa. We have Betty Abba, who's a journalist and author and activist from Nigeria, and she'll be talking about some of the work that she's doing with an NGO she started to empower young women and how COVID-19 is affecting informal sectors where a lot of these young women live. And last but not least, Faye, who is a founder and managing director of Open Square Africa, and has a lot of knowledge around the informal sector, again, in Nigeria, and has been helping businesses in the informal sector position themselves and market themselves. So he knows a lot about how this disease is affecting his clients. So can we see the poll results?
Yep, you should be able to see them now.
All of the above. Yeah, that's, I was expecting that, but interesting, 63% all of the above. Service sectors comes in second, and then informal goods, food and markets and kiosks. Wonderful, thank you for those answers. So let me introduce our first speaker, or hand over to our first speaker, Gigi Alcock from South Africa. Welcome to the platform, Gigi. I'm handing over to you.
Great, hi everyone. So yeah, so I'm going to talk very quickly about my subject matter. So I coined the phrase Garcinomics in Southern Africa because the term Garci is a term for the township or the informal sector. And basically, I believe this is the next great frontier of Africa. It is across Africa, undergoing a revolution. It's unrecognized because to a large extent it's either invisible on the one hand, or on the other hand it's massively fragmented. So because of this multitude of individual little businesses, we never realized the massive scale of it. And I believe that this informal sector is undergoing a revolution. And more importantly, the COVID status that we're in at the moment has actually fast-tracked, not delayed this, the importance of this sector. And it's going to continue to shape how the informal sector is growing, particularly how it's adapting to this disease. If we can go to the next slide. So, and I think maybe just put up all of those points on this slide. So it's a hugely fragmented sector, but because it's informal doesn't mean it's not sophisticated or particularly large. I just use examples in South Africa. In South Africa, for instance, we have what we call spaza shops, which is the bottom picture there, the Lucky 7 supermarket. The spazaret sector, we have spaza and spazarettes, which are kind of small supermarkets. We have 100,000 outlets turning over about 200 billion Rand a year. By comparison, the formal sector is turning over 350 billion Rand a year. So it just gives you an idea of the scale of this. This sector is massively disrupting the formal retail sector, the ShopRites, Pick n Pay, and other large corporates. And in fact, it's the only sector that's growing. Then we have what I call Garci fast food outlets. There's about 50,000 outlets in South Africa, turning over about 90 billion Rand in turnover a year. again, this is the sector in South Africa that's growing, seriously challenging the likes of KFC, McDonald's, and others. Residential and business rental in the informal sector is another huge sector. Just renting out to spouses or residential, what we call backroom rentals, a 40 billion rand a year sector. And then we have a whole range of others: vegetable traders, schoolyard hawkers, about 500,000 traders, hair salons and barbers. So many of these are familiar to any marketplace in Africa. Slight difference in nuance, but the reality is that most of this informal sector operates almost identically, particularly in any of the areas that I've worked across Africa. So there's a huge range of them. The important thing about it is that these are localized businesses. They're very personalized to their business sector, huge and sophisticated. And I think the big mistake we often make, if you look at the lady on the right-hand side of the screen who's selling what we call Vetkoek or amagwenya, which is like the croissant of the streets, she sells 3,000 of those every single day for R1 each. And so it's a lot of money in South Africa. She's making 30,000 Rand, which is what, $2,000 odd dollars a month profit from her little business. And yet we walk past it and we kind of see it as a survivalist and a subsistence business. She's been there for 11 years, trading on that space, making good money. The lady on the left-hand side is selling at a school. She sells in a schoolyard, and she makes 6,500 Rand a month profit. She's been trading there for 26 years. Again, we look at her and we don't consider this as a business. And so we need to change the lens of what we recognize as a business, and understand the dynamics of these different sectors. If we can go to the next slide. So what are some of the responses of these various businesses? The pictures on the left-hand side there, Sempagatini Bakery, is a bakery in Soweto, in a place called White City in Soweto, one of the roughest, poorest parts of Soweto. They are continuing to operate. They were massively impacted by the initial lockdown in South Africa. And then what they did is they invested in these little trolleys that you can see there with the umbrella. And they placed information on Facebook and via WhatsApp to all the people in the local suburbs, saying that you can order your bread from us by sending us a WhatsApp pin of your location and how many loaves of bread you would like. And so now they are delivering hundreds and hundreds of loaves of bread to these pin locations. Some of these guys are walking up to 15 kilometers a day delivering bread. The guy on the right-hand side, a guy called Kopano, who runs a little business called Kasi Convenience, which services the food outlets, so what's called a quarter, which is like the township hamburger, and other meals in the informal sector. He was immediately locked down because of the food outlets were restricted in South Africa. They're opening up on the on Friday, on the 1st, and the first thing that they've done already with his 60 odd customers that he delivers to, the restrictions in South Africa said that all fast food outlets can open on condition that they only do delivery. No takeaways, no drive-through, has to be delivery. Of course, in the townships, very rare to have any delivery. They have immediately set up a WhatsApp group similar to the bakery. They're developing menus that they've placed on Facebook, and people are able to start ordering. So the big thing about this sector is that the ability of the small businesses is they are agile. They are able to bunker down and close their hatches and wait until the bad times go past. They're able to pivot their businesses and adapt incredibly rapidly, something that larger corporate businesses are unable to do. You can go to the next one. So basically, in my mind, as I said earlier, the time of lockdown and distancing will fast track a new way of doing business. In developed economies, it's about online and virtual. I think there's a uniform sense that business will never be the same again, and that online and virtual businesses are going to continue to grow. The reality in Africa, this is going to be local and neighborhood, and it's going to be about WhatsApp and Facebook before online and internet. And the growth is going to be around how do these businesses adapt to local community, neighborhood business, and utilizing technology, basic technology like WhatsApp and Facebook to operate. Markets in Africa are invisible and highly fragmented. So the gig economy in many ways reflects the informal economy. If we look at the gig economy, Uber, Airbnb as an example, they're invisible and they're highly fragmented. The same happens in the African informal markets. So how do we supply to this? We have to consider an invisible and highly fragmented market. The second element is customers want lots of small amounts regularly, no huge trucks or cargo or anything like that. So how do we build route to market operations that work on that basis? And this really brings us to the need for databases, geolocation, payment, ordering systems. And the informal economy is not technologically driven. So how do we adapt to that? Go to the next. I think just put all three of these up. So these are some examples of businesses which are really a transforming thing. I wrote my book, Gastronomic Revolution, about gastronomic revolutionaries. The one on the left-hand side is a South African business, Hello Pesa, that does money transfer. They've developed this app where you can order your food, your groceries using Q codes and send those groceries to Zimbabwe and Malawi via this platform. And in essence, the person who developed this saw this happening in South Korea and thought, why wouldn't it happen in Zimbabwe and Malawi and South Africa? Quite extraordinary. The second one is the Toleram Group in Nigeria with noodles, a massive distribution platform. Data free in South Africa, the Moya Messenger. I think that the future is going to be very much about data free and the impact of that. I think last slide. This is the township hamburger in South Africa. It's called a Kota. We built for Parmalat a 2.5 billion rand a year industry by driving cheese slices into the sector with a fairly fragmented, highly sophisticated distribution system. So the opportunities are there. It's about these businesses, how they're going to adapt and how they're going to change. I think that's me. I guess the last thing is that if we click to the last, business mirrors biology. Darwin said, it's not the strongest or the most intelligent who are going to survive, but the most adaptable to change. My belief is that the informal sector, to most extents, is adaptable to change. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gigi. And for those of us who are joining us as participants, please feel free to we welcome all of your questions for Gigi and for all of the speakers in the chat box. We'll have about 25 minutes at the end of this for a discussion with the speakers and possibly some opportunity for the audience to contribute their perspectives as well. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat box. We'll save them for the end. And Betty will be our next speaker. I think your slides are up, Betty, so I'm going to unmute you. And please go right ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Betty, we can hear you now. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, I'm trying to. Okay, yeah, that's fine. Okay, so I'll be talking about the economic impact of COVID-19 on informal sector in Nigeria, and I'm using Makoko community as a case study. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes,
okay.
And you might just want to provide some context on Makoko for those who are not
yes.
familiar with it.
So I'll go to that. Okay. So like the previous speaker has said, the COVID-19 shutdown and associated disruptions have really taken a toll most on the informal sector. So I'll be talking mostly from my point of view, from my experience as a charity worker, as one who works with marginalized communities such as Makoko, so not as an economist. So it's like an hands-on experience, what's going on now with marginalized communities, the informal sectors. So next slide, please. Can we have the next slide? Can we have the next slide? Okay, so just a little bit of context on Makoko. Makoko is a community that we call City on Water. Makoko is situated in Lagos State, Nigeria. Lagos is the biggest metropolitan city in Nigeria, but somehow Makoko is a very conservative and an indigenous community right in the middle of Lagos with over 100,000 people. Makoko is basically a fishing community. So you have all kinds of artisans, petty traders in the community. And what makes Makoko stand out is the fact that first is the largest urban settlement in West Africa. It's also unique in every respect. You have houses built on water, economic activities going on in the community. You see like mobile shops, mobile restaurants. So it's quite unique and it's become more like a tourist marvel. But then Makoko has had to grapple with poverty over the years because of the lack of opportunities for most of the residents. So next slide. Can we have the next slide, please? Hello?
Yeah,
Okay.
Betty, there's a couple of second delay in the slides, so we're queuing them up. You can just go ahead and
sorry. Okay, so just a little bit of the image from Makoko. To your extreme right, you have the floating school, which made Makoko very popular a couple of years ago. It's collapsed now, so it's no longer there. But that was what brought Makoko to the attention of the world. So this is what life is like in Makoko. So you can see the level of poverty, the uniqueness of the architecture, and the fact that it's a predominantly fishing community. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so just like Makoko, the informal community in Nigeria is having it very hard at this point because they are normally not calculated or factored into government stimuli plans or palliatives, significant palliatives to really withstand economic shocks when you have things like this happening. And so you, like the previous speaker said, in the informal sector, you have the barbers. In Makoko, for instance, you have the fish smokers, the fish sellers, the fishermen who sell their fishes to the women. So basically, life has been brought to a standstill in virtually every segment, in all segments of the economy and virtually every corner of Nigeria. And so because these people depend on daily survival, they will have to survive by making daily income. They depend on daily income. It's really impacted on their families, on their lives in general. Many have had to depend on palliatives, on non-governmental organizations, from government, which is not actually going round. So it goes to show the fragility of the informal sector, how fragile it is, the lack of sustainability, the fact that the informal sector in places like Nigeria are not factored into government assistance. So when there's a little shock, when there's a little disruption, it's like everyone is back to square one. People just become beggars. And it's really, really hard. And to think that the informal sector contributes about 70% of the GDP to the Nigerian, contributes about 70% to the Nigerian GDP. It's really unfortunate that that same sector is not being upheld. That same sector is not supported in a way that is sustainable and that it really grows. Okay, next point. Next slide. Okay, so these are some of the things I've already spoken about the significance of the informal sector and the fact that it's largely neglected by governments. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so these are some of the things I've already mentioned. Like, for instance, in Makoko, because to really show how poor a community like Makoko is, the schools in Makoko that are basically built on water operate on a daily school fees paying basis. And it's so shocking to people when I talk about it, but that is the reality. Every single school on the water side, the schools are there's hardly any presence of government on in the community. So this run is like a self-sustained. So the schools are private schools, and then children go to school every single day with their school fees. When I got into Makoko about 7 years ago, it was 20 naira. I don't know the conversion in dollar now. It's now 50 naira, which is really, really small. Children, so once children don't have that money, they cannot access education for that day. And I guess that is the only place in the whole world where children pay school fees on a daily basis. It goes to show how fragile the economies of the families are, that they cannot afford to pay school fees in lump sum. And so they have to pay instrumentally every single day. Okay, next slide. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, so my recommendation at this point would be that government should make conscious effort to engage the informal sector, to empower the informal sector, to make it to be part of, to enjoy the stimuli measures and perks enjoyed by the formal sector. Because after all, the informal sector controls the major aspects of the economy, and majority of the citizens are involved in the informal sector. I believe that the COVID-19 shutdown has taught us a lot of lessons, that majority of the population have had to depend on government palliatives. It shows that there is really nothing to fall back to. There is really no sustainability in the informal sector, and government could have made a lot of difference. Government could have prevented all this from happening. And then the need for government to really engage people in the informal housing, who are basically small business people, and who in Lagos, for instance, we've had this forced eviction thing happening over and over again, and people are completely destabilized. Their economies, their lives are destabilized all of the time by a government which is supposed to support them. And there seems to be no help from somewhere, and it seems to be an ongoing thing. You can't believe that just about 2 weeks ago, there was forced demolition in Lagos State. A state that says everyone should stay at home. There's a virus that is ravaging the country, and Lagos incidentally happens to have the highest number of people who are infected by COVID-19. And then you are throwing people into the streets. It just doesn't make any sense. So that goes to show the lack of regards by the government of the day for people in the informal sector, in the informal housing. And this will actually change drastically when government decides to pay a little more attention, just a little more attention. Next slide.
So, Betty, we're running out of time.
I'm running off. Next slide, if you can make it faster too. Okay, just a little bit of our work in Makoko. I work with young people in the community. We engage them on a number of life improvement programs, scholarship, mentorship, economic skill empowerment, and various other things. And we've found that there's a lot of potentials in these communities are usually neglected and forgotten by the rest of society. And then these are some of the things we've done in terms of our COVID-19 intervention. We've done several sensitization programs, jingles, posters, other things targeted at the children, because a community like Makoko is densely populated. So besides the economic downturn, besides the economic impact, if safety measures are not adhered to, and there's an infection in the community, it could be very, very catastrophic, because it's something that could blow up, and then you have thousands of people infected. So we really need, so we're targeting, because we work with young people, we're targeting most of the sensitization program to young people. Then we also have food relief measures just recently, the Lagos State government, the federal government selected our NGO as one of the 10 NGOs in Lagos to deliver food to poor households, which we believe will kick off this week.
Hi, Betty.
Next slide.
Sorry,
I think
sorry
we're
to
basically
interrupt you. Sorry to interrupt you. We need to move on to the next speaker. What I suggest is...
I think we're basically through.
Oh, wonderful. Okay.
I think we got through most of the slides.
All right. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much,
Thank you,
Betty. And we've had some good questions coming in, so we'll come back to those in a bit. For now, I would like to pose the second poll to the audience. So you should be able to see it come up on your screen. We'll give you maybe about 30 seconds to put in your response. What we want to know from all of you is what measures you think could best reduce the impact of COVID-19 on the informal economy. So are tax incentives effective, reduction on energy costs, interest rates, livable wages for the unemployed right now, any stimulus packages? Now keep in mind, we're thinking about the informal economy here. So which of these do you actually think would support the informal economy sectors? And maybe we'll give you another 5 seconds to submit your responses. Excellent. Thank you everyone for putting your responses in. I'm give you another 2 seconds before I end the poll. And you should be able to see the results here. So it looks like there's quite a number of folks who look like stimulus packages for companies employing informal workers is the most popular, sort of followed by livable wages. So that really picks up from the conversation we were having last week around cash versus vouchers to give people for, you know, those living in informal economies. And then looks like health and safety conditions are in the top 3 as well. So super. So we will now move into Faye. Margaret, if we can move to Faye's responses, and Faye, over to you. And just do keep in mind there's about a 2-second delay when we're moving to the next slide. So just keep that in mind as we move ahead. Over to you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me well?
Yes, we
loud
can.
and clear, Faye.
Awesome. Yeah, so just to share a couple of thoughts on my views on the economic impact of this ongoing pandemic in the informal sector. To give context, I run a consulting firm called Open Squares, where we focus specifically on helping firms that are interested in the nuances of the African market. And we've published our approach in a book called The Villager, How Africans Consume Brands. If you could go to the next slide, I think the next 2 slides, where the talking points start from. Yes. So I think, just to give context to what we are doing as a business and what I think other businesses could also, what they could do. Some of these augment what the 2 other speakers have said. Staying at home is very critical. We know that the curve is not yet flattened in African countries, likely because we're just now getting the capability to test and all of that. In our case, our work is consulting and is IP based, so we basically can continue to add value to our clients remotely and all of that, which is true for quite a number of service companies. I think the second thing that's very key is also to keep staff engaged. The reason this is key really is that this one of the roles of business leaders now really is to administer hope to the communities that they work in, the people that work with them, the people in their immediate community, and that they're keeping continual communication ongoing is very key to that, especially as new issues arise. On a weekly or on a daily basis, new test results are posted by NCDC in Nigeria. The government speaks every couple of weeks. It's important to keep people engaged and keep talking to them. As much as possible, we endeavor to protect staff income. The reason this is key is because no matter the instructions and the recommendations of the health professionals, evidence has shown that people tend to break healthcare protocols when their livelihood is threatened. as long as they're not able to put food on the table, they will go out and do something. We have an interesting situation now in Lagos where I live, where there's a bunch of almost like a cabal of armed robbers who call themselves the 1 million boys. And basically, these guys just sent letters ahead to estates where middle income and upper class people live and tell them they're coming to rob them, and they come to rob them, and they're robbing simply for survival. They just need money to live. Next slide, please. Yeah, and so a couple of learnings for us, and I'm so glad Gigi talked about the issues of using informal sector and all of WhatsApp and all of that in the informal sector. It's important to tech enable your business as soon as possible. There's no business that cannot be tech enabled, and tech for us also includes things like WhatsApp, like Gigi said. It amplifies the ability of a business to deliver during this time to their customers wherever they are. It's also important to stay as close as possible to customers to continue to gather real-time data on their behavior. This is very valuable to businesses. It's something that businesses are looking at and say, what is happening right now? How do we adapt our offerings and so on and so forth? Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah. Now, a lot has been said about the help that needs to be done, and all of those are valid. So I'd just like to add these two to those. It's important that targeted funding is made available to support innovations within business models down for SMEs, the informal sector, where that can help them to deliver to their customers in newer and cost-effective ways. Then we've got to begin to think about workspace solutions. A lot of SMEs and people in the informal sector work in shared offices and shared workspaces. The question now is, in a post-COVID world, where there are key health protocols that we need to follow, how do we rethink what our workspace solutions will need? Because Africa is still a very physical interaction-based business environment. So how do we account for that? How do we put all of that in place? So these are just two thoughts that I thought I could add in addition to what the couple of the other speakers have said about the things that need to be done by the government and be done by businesses to support everyone at this time. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Faye. And thank you, Betty and Gigi, for all of your insights. I think we've had a lot of really good questions coming in through the chat box. So Faye, maybe I'll start with you. James has asked this, and I think it's a really interesting question, is, I think both you and Gigi alluded to the ability for people to sort of go online and sort of sell their services or provide their goods. How do we actually support tech enabling the informal sector? Or do you see that the informal sector is, I know Gigi, you mentioned people are already posting their menus and things on Facebook, but how do we actually support these informal economies to move online? So we'll start with you, Faye. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is we have a benefit already on the continent, which is that almost a huge population use feature phones, right? And there are a lot of applications that work off the feature phones that they are not feature heavy. WhatsApp is a good example. But if there's a way if we could develop just means of educating business owners in the informal sector to do something as basic as putting together a menu and sharing that through their customers' network, for instance, that's a starting point. Some of them don't have the level of education or exposure to even do that, but that's one area we can support and then we have to think about the issue of logistics. How do we actually get those products delivered, and that's where things like that very unique to Africa, like the motorcycles and the tricycles, Okada in Lagos, Boda in East Africa, and so on and so forth, can come in useful to enable those businesses. So we have to find a very clever combination of logistics and very low-end technology that will enable goods and services to be shared. The payment solutions are already there. that's not going to be where the challenge will be.
Super. Thanks, Faye. I'm going to go back to Gigi now. There was actually several questions that were really looking at access to financing. I think Mercy, good to see you, Mercy, asked this a little bit earlier. On what impact is this really having on access to financing? And I mean, someone had actually posed a question to us before we launched the webinar, was that some of the government incentives that are providing, you know, tax cuts and interest cut rates are not necessarily reaching the microfinance institutions and the SACCOs. So really, when we're looking at the access for informal lending and access to financing, do you have any sort of thoughts on how this is impacting that directly?
Cool. Can I just add to Faye's comment first, and then I'll come to the financing? I think just very quickly,
Please do.
I think the reality is that technology has to be the way forward, but the issue is generally cost of data and access to data. And so we have a high level of feature phones throughout Africa and an adoption of things like WhatsApp and so on. I think the big opportunity is around platforms like the one I showed, which is hash data free, which in essence gives you access to something called Moya Messenger as an example, which is a WhatsApp lookalike, but all text messaging is for free. And the reason I say this is that we really need in this space platforms like Shopify that are based on a data-free platform, where in essence people can go and build their ability to take orders, to do online shopping or whatever it might be. And the shift has to be away from online to app-based and low data or data-free app-based opportunities. That HelloPesa, Malaysia case study is a case in point. Going to the finance, I think to a large extent, and I'll talk to South Africa as a thing. So the micro-lending industry has been locked down at this stage, probably at a time when probably people most need to be able to access loans. I think for me, the biggest issue is about most of the informal traders are going to go through they're going to eat their products. And the hardest part is going to be about how do they reignite their businesses. I've been working on a platform with the business community in South Africa looking at a rotating credit type facility, because the biggest issue is going to be how do they restock their small businesses? How do they get going again? And I think that the big opportunity is around how do governments provide credit guarantees to either suppliers or to banks to enable this credit. The biggest problem is that the credit that these informal businesses are going to look for in rand terms is going to be not 100 or 200,000 or 300 or whatever it might be. It's going to be 5,000 rand, 10,000 rand, 25,000 rand as an example. And very few entities are structured to loan money on this small basis. And that goes back to what I said about this fragmented nature of this business. It's about how do you supply a multitude of small amounts of money to informal traders, you know, and on a large scale, but rather than a large loan on a small scale, a large number of loans, of small loans. So it's a problem, I guess, more than saying that there's any solutions. We are working on some options in South Africa, and I do think that to a large extent the credit industry, there's people like Premier Credit in Kenya as an example who lend small amounts of money to small businesses. Those private sector credit entities probably need to come to the party in terms of offering loans at better rates and so on. So it really, for me, it would be how do we get the private sector to get involved on this level.
Great, thanks for that, Gigi. And Betty, I'll come to you next if you want to unmute your microphone. Sort of connected to the finance topic, there was a question from TK that's asking specifically on the daily school fees issue. TK asks, is the Nigerian government or any NGOs doing anything to support families in Makoko to pay fees? Are scholarships available? Are there any interventions on the sort of daily fees topic there.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Betty, we can hear you. Yes.
Okay, so right now there's no form of support from government, but we have several NGOs working in Makoko, and because of the sheer population of the children and the poverty level, there's a lot of empowerment. There are lots of empowerment programs, and one of them is a scholarship. There are several NGOs that's involved in a scholarship for the children. Some provide school materials, some pay school fees, and our organization, Teen Hope, also is involved in the scholarship empowerment for several children in the community. But because you have such a huge number of children, we're not able to help everybody. And so sometimes some of the our adopted schools, we go there and they say up to 100 children are not in school today. Up to 50 children are not in school today because their parents couldn't give them 15 naira to come. And so it's really a huge problem because most of the NGOs working on empowerment in Makoko are underfunded. And so we're not able to go around the problem to be able to pay for every single child. So most of the time it's the parents that pay. And then the ones who are able to pay will just pay like the whole term. And you can imagine a whole term is about 3,000 naira. 3,000 naira is about $7. And it may look for people maybe that's in the middle class and all of that are well off. It may look like small money, but it's a lot for families that are of 8 children, 7 children, 5 children to be able to pay in bulk for all the children. They are of school age. So right now, I'm not aware of any form of government support. In fact, the government, especially Lagos State government, is more keen on ensuring that Makoko as a community is demolished and moved away. They are not interested in upgrading this community. They are not interested in investing in the lives of the people or reaching out to them in terms of social services. They just want them to move. And what actually brought Makoko into international reckoning was a forced eviction notice, a forced eviction attempt by the state government in July 2012, where the community was given 72 hours to vacate. You have a community of over 100,000, and then you are giving them 72 hours to vacate when there was a pending court judgment. And when they were not able to vacate, because how do you move your entire family? How do you get out within 72 hours? So the government came and started demolishing houses. Some children fell into the water, some were rescued. A local chief was killed by one of the government operatives. So neither the state or the federal government is interested in any empowerment activity as far as Makoko is concerned, but that's a completely is another topic altogether. But the fact is that most of the assistance comes from local non-governmental organizations such as ours.
Okay, thank you, Betty. So the government is really not going to be effective in these sort of times. And there's sort of an interesting conversation going in the chat box related to that. You know, there are a lot of governments that are offering tax incentives and these things, but that's actually not reaching the informal economy. So as much as the government maybe is trying to implement some of these things, Vanessa mentioned, like some countries like Morocco implemented a simplified business registration process to formalize the informal businesses. And maybe Faye, I'll come back to you on this. I mean, do you see the sort of government interventions really at odds with being effective in informal economies? I mean, do you think the government can play a role here, or do you think, like Betty, it's really going to be up to more to community-based organizations and NGOs to sort of alleviate this economic risk for the informal sector?
Yeah, I think the only arm of government really that is best positioned to do anything will be the local government, the local government offices. The reason for that is that you see that the federal government and the state government tend to develop policies that are on an aggregated level, mostly serve large corporations, and you can understand the reason why. The incentive for the federal and state government is that the tax base of large organizations, if you look at it on a single basis, is quite significant for them. Thinking of the tax for a woman that makes, I don't know, 50,000 naira a month is not a very exciting proposition to a state governor, for instance. So the closest arm of government will be the local government, but again, we still need help from other organizations and businesses that are closer to these communities, who can then partner with the local government to provide the right solutions. But the informal sector has to be treated quite like a separate entity of state that needs to be approached completely different.
Super, thanks, Faye. Gigi, any thoughts on that before I come to you with the next question that was specifically posed for you?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest issues is that generally the informal sector is not considered as a business sector, and the first thing that we need is governments and financial institutions and everything to change their perspective. I mean, that's one of the reasons I highlight, like my presentation, that many of these businesses are actually making really good money, and yet we see them as survivalist and subsistence businesses. And when we see them as survivalist and subsistence, we assume that tomorrow, if they found a formal job, they would leave their business and they would take a formal job, which is absolute rubbish. And so when governments, municipalities, financial institutions, and so on recognize this as a legitimate business sector, like the gig economy, an Airbnb and an Uber driver is increasingly, for a long time, wasn't recognized as a business. And now there's a recognition that that gig economy is its own business sector. We need the same with the informal sector, recognition of that, because then we start regulating, we start creating financial products, we start creating bylaws, municipal things, whatever it might be, we start designing them for a part of our business sector. And that becomes critical. I think the starting point is, let's recognize these as businesses, as a legitimate, long-term, established business sector, and then we start planning, building, making laws, and so on for the sector.
Absolutely. So sort of formalizing that informal economy and recognizing that, I think, to sort of Vanessa's point about what they're trying to do in Morocco. Gigi, Sam had asked a specific question for you. I think it's not just limiting to recognizing the informal businesses as an economy, but also recognizing informal workers. So one of the questions was specifically around migrant workers. And I think in South Africa, you probably experience this more than we do here in Kenya. I mean, really, what do you see as the impact for migrant workers, and how are those people, being affected? If they're not even documented, there's no way that any sort of stimulus package or relief would reach them. Do you have any sort of thoughts on that?
So in South Africa, we have a particularly big problem with that, because the social grant system, which gives grants to mothers and pensioners, doesn't apply to immigrant workers, and we've actually seen, to a large extent, a fair amount of social unrest caused by these workers who are unable to carry on operating. And it's a problem, and I think the government is seriously remiss as seeing immigrant workers as foreigners, as they're called, and not catering for them. But that's another issue. One of the things that we're looking at, and I think is an important thing, is about, let's get these informal workers back to work. So we are busy in a drive at the moment with some business entities around saying, how do we, like Faye said, these workers and these informal businesses need to get back to work, because if they can't get a livelihood, they're just going to do it illegally, out of sight, and not follow any kind of hygiene measures. So the big thing at the moment is they've just released in South Africa the ability for recyclers and the similar sector to open again. I believe that we need to push government to allow certain immigrant sectors where there are where they're not getting any social grant benefits to get back to work. And I think across Africa, this has got to be the issue, is that how do we allow people to get back to work? And my belief is you can't keep people we're applying a Western model in terms of lockdowns. We should be restricting people to the street, because the reality is these businesses are residential business. 80% of businesses are street businesses. People operate within a street or within a neighborhood. Let's restrict the lockdown to street, and then we allow the little hair salon, or we allow the little vegetable trader, we allow the fast food outlet that's in the street to operate within the street, and then you can't leave that street, because the practicality of stay at home is rubbish. Most places can't do that, number one. And number two, the informal businesses are operating in the street, and they do not need people to take public transport. They don't need people to stand in a queue at a formal retailer. And so in essence, we should enable them to start work. And that's what I believe the opportunity is. Let's get people back to work, whether it's on a street basis, limited basis, let's get them back to work.
Okay, great. And maybe we just have, we're running out of time, but Betty, I have one last question I wanted to pose for you. So in the interest of time, we'll just try to keep your answer as succinct as possible. Urvashi from India was asking a question specifically about the economic impact on women and their ability to save and grow. And specifically, she was asking, you know, do they have enough savings to sort of get through this economic time? Faye, I also see you nodding. If you want to contribute to this after Betty, you're welcome to. Betty, any specific thoughts on the impact of women, and if they can't work right now due to the the restrictions, do they actually have enough savings to survive? We know you mentioned they don't even have enough money to put their kids through school. Do you want to just share your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yes, thank you so much. Women actually bear the biggest brunt of this whole impact of COVID-19, because in many communities across Nigeria, you see the women with having so many children, and then many of them are actually the breadwinners in their homes. It may not apply to every home, but in many of the communities. And then these are people that survive, whose families survive on a day-to-day basis. So majority of the families we work with are actually in a very bad shape, economically. There are no savings. That is just the basic truth. There are no savings. Everything in the last 3 weeks or 1 month has gone into feeding. No safety net, nothing. And so from the little businesses that do, they are basically reduced to beggars, depending on palliatives provided by NGOs, and then a few times by government. Most of the time, the government palliatives don't reach down. And we're wondering, but when government wants the vote of these same people, they are able to locate them in all the corners. But right now, government cannot locate many people, especially in very marginalized and remote communities. So, and then we've had a few cases where people actually protested openly. They said they're not going to stay at home anymore. They will have to take the risk of being killed by COVID-19 because they need to provide for their families. So it's a very bleak situation. There are no savings. Women are not having it easy at all. The impact is so much because they're actually the caregivers in the home. So they'll have to find food for the children at all costs. The children don't bother to know. So it's really, the impact is really huge on our women.
Yeah, so a disproportionate negative effect on women, most definitely. Yes. And I think we'll tackle this in a separate webinar. But Faye, I know you were nodding sort of when I posed the question. If you want to unmute and share maybe a quick 30 seconds, because we're running
yeah, just a couple of thoughts. One is, I mean, what Gigi said about restricting to the streets it's so insightful, because it's almost as if the government were to choose which sectors to sort of ease first, it should be the informal sector, because the formal sector have a basic formula to coming out of economic crisis. They start by laying off and cutting costs, which increases the unemployment in that sector, whereas the informal sector want to produce more goods and services, which tends to drive up employment, which, when aggregated, adds value. To Betty's comment, that it's true, there's there's a lot of unnecessary effects on women during this period. Obviously, because they are the caregivers, the kids are also locked at home. They can't go to school. There are also reports now, increasing reports of women that are undergoing abuse, who also can no longer reach for help because the organizations and institutions that would traditionally help them are also on lockdown. And that's something that the government needs to look at and address very, very quickly.
Thanks so much, Faye. And I realize we're running short on time, but there's now been a very interesting thread on the chat, and I don't know which of you, or if any. I mean, we can. If anyone wants to respond to this, who's on the call, sort of about the sectors that are getting involved. Has anybody on this call seen, any informal sectors adjust their primary services to producing cloth masks, hand sanitizers? I know in Kenya, the day that the law came out where you had to wear a face mask, all of a sudden we had all these kitenge masks, which is the local fabric here, on the streets already, with hawkers on the road. I think it is an interesting question as to whether any informal sector businesses have seen that pivot in terms of their actual sector and service that they're providing.
If I may jump in on that, if I may just take the first stab at that. What we've seen is a lot of the neighborhood tailors in the street who traditionally make their income off sewing clothes for people going for, in Africa we go for parties for every reason, and now they are the ones making cloth masks and putting it on WhatsApp groups and saying it's this amount, you can come and buy this and all of that, and most of them are making the cloth mask from leftover fabric, which they have from previous tailoring assignments. So it's quite a fascinating innovation in that particular informal sector.
Yeah, so we've seen the same in South Africa with people who are doing sewing stuff, making masks. And to the question, we bought some in my home, some from a lady who was selling picnic blankets and other things to affluent people in the neighborhood, now making these masks. And they're probably a higher quality and better made than, with more layers than any of the ones that you would generally find available. So, and I think this is the issue, the informal sector is not about low quality, it's just informal, it's not about cheap, it's just about informal again, so we often make these mistakes of seeing informal as low quality, low cost, unsophisticated. No, they're just informal, supplying different services at a different level. And we certainly saw this with some of the protective equipment. And the same with what I call the spazarettes, seeing them very quickly pivot to offering sanitizers, to arranging marks on the floor so that people could stand far apart when they were coming up to the till and so on. This happens much quicker than the supermarkets. The Spazarette was implementing sanitizer and stuff incredibly quickly. And primarily because they were Somali owned to a large extent, and they knew that they were going to be closed. Any excuse the police could have, they would close them down. So they made sure that they were squeaky clean very quickly.
Yeah, so it goes back to that point of around adaptability, particularly during this time. So I think I realize that we're about 5 or 6 minutes over. So Margaret, if you want to move to the next slide, Nancy, I'll hand it over to you to wrap everything up for us.
Thank you very much to all the speakers, Faye, Betty, Gigi. It's been a really robust conversation, I think, and we could go on for at least another 3 hours, but unfortunately we don't have that time. But thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And to all the participants who've been very active in the chat, we'd like to hear from you in terms of if you'd like this series to be a little bit longer, maybe 1.5 hours every Thursday. And we'd also like to hear from all of you about the topics that you'd like to discuss and the speakers that you'd like to hear from. So please feel free to let us know what's on your mind and what you'd like us to cover next. So we've come to the close of yet another session, and we're excited to see that so many people are interested in these conversations. I just wanted to highlight that we'll be sending out some material to all the participants and the speakers, just giving you some updates on the other kind of platforms you could connect on. We have WhatsApp and Slack in all 3 countries, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. And in front of you, you'll see contact information if you need to speak to get in touch with any of us. If you have questions on your mind, or like I said, if you have specific speakers you'd like to hear from and topics you'd like to discuss, we want to know what you have on your mind and what you'd like to hear. So with that, I'd like to say thank you and have a wonderful day, and please keep safe. Thank you.